I am the bard who has seen light and darkness from whence they were still entangled, and has seen them shifting between one another. The rest of the colony caravan finally arrived along with Yendri. They found a lot of dead hobgoblins, some rather bloody paladins, and a roaring fire that Peregrine had gotten to work setting up. Ladies and gentlemen of this fine colonization effort, it is my privilege to welcome you at last to the Northern Garden. Peregrine chirped to the leaders. Quit clowning around and help me move this handle, Cazador grumbled good-naturedly as he hauled the anvil back into place on the shrine. The caravan moved into the old camp for now, and there disposed of the bodies, equipping themselves with what armor and weapons they could find. Sinkat, Julian, and Cazador met with the Peregrine, filling him in. Peregrine and Yendri set out to scout the forest at the base of the hill and do a bit of hunting. After serious discussion, it was agreed that the Paladins would work as scouts and outriders to investigate the forest and try to find a place to set up. Meanwhile, down the hill, Yendri spied and brought down an elk with her bow. Peregrine, meanwhile, found a running stream to lay his net and line in. As he reclined and waited for a bite, he heard a sound in the brush on the opposite side of the stream. He climbed up a tree and bounced across a limb to peer through to the other side. He spied there a troop of halflings carrying a canoe quickly and quietly through the bushes. He shouted a greeting in halfling, and was answered with a hail of stones and darts, which sent him stumbling off his branch and into the stream with a loud splash. Yenri heard the sound and rushed to help, only to find Peregrine, and a large number of fish, tangled up in his net. She hauled the waterlogged wanderer out along with his catch. "For such a slippery swordsman, a remarkably clumsy little one," she remarked with a wry grin on her face. "I didn't fall, I was pushed, from a distance, by a lot of pebbles and darts. There's other halflings here," he burbled out, his unexpected bath doing nothing to blunt his joviality. Well, that explained it. They certainly knew how much trouble he'd be, if they followed them home, and probably didn't have enough food for another mouth, especially one as big as yours. Humph! Curl their hair if that's what it was. Not sharing food is just plain selfish. I'd make it back in quality anyways. Of course. Let's get back so we've time to report, and you can back those words up. The two headed back and made their report. No one was particularly concerned, for halflings are almost always goodly folk, and with a goblinoid horde blighting the land, it stood to reason that they'd be particularly cautious. As the day dimmed, the fire was up, and Peregrine got to work cooking. As he was cooking the elk, a stiff breeze blew ashes up towards his meat, only to switch round at the last second, and instead sweep wild herbs into the fire, filling the air with a delectable aroma. Everyone enjoyed the meal. Cazador in particular thoroughly enjoyed the meat, earning a few wry grins from Senket and Yendri. Julian suddenly realized to his horror that he still couldn't eat, due to having his helmet stuck on. Several minutes of yanking, pulling, and general neck wrenching ensued before Peregrine got the idea to move it off using grease from the meal. One batch of screaming later, the party finally got to see what Julian looked like. It was somewhat disappointing, to say the least. The Asmar's skin was a pale sea green, with strange indigo eyes. He had no pupils whatsoever. His features were very plain, and not exactly the manliest figure. He looked younger than his years, with a smooth face, slightly rounded, better suited to study than swordsmanship. His head was shaved, as was his face, save his eyebrows, raven black. As the feast wound down, Peregrine got out his pipe and began to smoke, hand on his belly as he digested. It's only right and proper that we have a tale to aid the digestion, and as the only properly sized fellow here, I suppose it falls to me to tell it. What would you care to hear? Sigcat piped up. I've never seen that crest you wear. How did you come by it? He smiled. Ah, these are the swords of Avery, halfling god of war. Not many know 'em, since we're not the sort to go conquering. Wars are nasty business, make you late for supper. But sometimes war comes to us, despite the goddess's best efforts. So it was in Avery's day, when Tiamat still walked this plane. Faces scowled, and more than a few harsh glares were thrown Cazador's way as at the mention of the Dragon Queen. The Dragon Queen's avarice was so great that all the world would be her horde, the villages of the halflings included. So her armies came, and for a while Avery beat them back, armed only with a stout staff, until she herself came and slew the valiant warrior with her fell breath of every color. He awoke in that golden shire the goddess prepared for us, and there at once sought her out. He begged her to teach him where to find the weapons to save his people and defeat this evil. So she told him, and so out he went, down, 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 into that darkest of places, the abyss, to the dominion of Orcus, Prince of Undeath. He snuck into that mausoleum palace where the unliving lord slept, and stole his front 2 teeth. In his hands the rotted fangs became 2 swords sized for him. With these he named Dragon Biter here and Drake Muncher, and he cut his way back into the living, and drove Tiamat and her legions back into the Nine Hells, stealing away a portion of her godly essence, so that he might watch us forevermore. A fail tale, and such wicked weapons, not something I expected from the little folk, Henry admitted. I said much the same when the priest first told it to me, but there's a lesson in it, like all proper tales. Every weapon, no matter how pretty it is, or how righteous the cause it strikes for, is a tool for death. He turned his cloak, and in the firelight all could see that his short swords had hilts of bone. For that reason, all we who follow Avery carry swords with bone hilts, to remind us of how great and terrible a thing we carry, and not to use it lightly. With that, the story closed, and the evening with it. Soon guards were posted, and beds gone to. In the dead of night, Peregrine awoke to find Gendry tossing and turning in her sleep. Also, she was sleeping, not entering trance. The very confused Flynn quickly shook her awake, and got a dagger at his throat for this trouble. Easy, Yen, I'm just the cook. I know the deer might have given you some indigestion, but killing me is a gross overreaction. The pale hair relaxed as she slipped the dagger back in her boot. Sorry, little one, you startled me. It's okay. Didn't realize old said nightmares. I didn't even think you slept, really. Most of us don't. We enter a trance where we relive the memories of our past lives. No. So why aren't you doing that? She frowned. That's rather personal, little one. I promise I won't trust a soul. You can trust me. Honest. I'm sorry, little one, but this isn't for you. It's not for anyone but me and my own goddess to puzzle out. Peregrine was somewhat sad and confused, but he nodded with acceptance. All right. I won't tell anyone. Meanwhile, Gendry wasn't the only one having bad dreams. Sinket was in a forest. It was dark there, dark without moon or stars, and only her diabolical vision saw. The trees were strangled, countless vines like a billion grasping arms, pulsing with life, like black veins, throttled them. She called for a light, the light of the sun she bore. Her morning star flared, and the dark veins slipped away from her. In the distance she could see a similar light. She headed towards it, walking an ancient and forgotten road past a long-abandoned chapel. She came through the clearing and saw a building, wreathed in solar flames, an ancient abbey burning as a beacon, though like the last embers of an untended fire. Above the gate a lone tiefling stood, holding a mighty sword in his hands against the pulsing dark. He turned and looked directly at her. One word burned into her mind as she awoke, the light of dawn burning her eyes. Come. After a successful feast and some strange dreams that came from either divine intervention or severe indigestion, the Paladins awoke. Senket explained her dream and suggested they seek this abbey in the forest. Yenri voiced her support for this, but Cazador was somewhat skeptical. I'm nae exactly the one for chasing after strange dreams. Julian countered. I'm inclined to believe the dream. Ancestors and spirits talk to one another on a fairly regular basis, don't they? I'm nae saying it dinna happen, but even if it's an ancestor or a spirit, it's nae exactly a guardian angel. Nae offense, Shin. I'm used to it. I doubt it's an ancestor, though. My family have always lived in the southwest. We've certainly never come this far north. It's the rest of the dream that concerns me the most, Peregrine muttered. Wicked vines strangling the forest, a dark without star or moon. That reminds me of a few too many stories. A halfling actually scared of something? Ye gods, this is new, Julian remarked dryly. Not scared, but not foolhardy either, especially since I encountered my rather hostile brethren the other day. Something's not as it seems here, but we won't get any answers sitting around. I say, we seek the abbey. Ah, well, the wee laddie has a better head than most. I'll seek it with ye, and if it's a trick or a trap, you'll be needing my accents. So I can nae let you go without me. Thus determined, the party gathered supplies from the camp, only to find that several people, including the caravan's original leader, had fallen ill. They debated staying, but their new leader told them they needed scouting and possibly someone to go find other settlements more than they needed more guards. They'd hold in the town. With rations, water, and other supplies in hand, the paladins marched into the forest. They briefly considered taking horses, but without any known paths, they decided it was better to be silent and able to better maneuver through the woods. Gendry took the lead, with Peregrine taking up the rear. They followed their old trail back to the stream and followed it down, heading westwards through the forest, hoping that they might perhaps encounter the halflings again. After about an hour, Gendry heard rough voices speaking in Goblin and called a halt to listen. "Stupid slave kids! Don't stand still! Kill that stupid big bear thing! It make fine belt look. I give big boss, get many shiny things for me!" Angry roar screeching could be heard, as well as much screeching. "Goblins ahead, and better yet, something killing goblins," Gazador said, as he removed his axes. Gendry wasn't sure exactly what they were dealing with. "Give me a moment to get closer and see what's going on. Peregrine, I'd appreciate your help." She pulled a whistle arrow from her bag and showed it to the group. "If we're spotted, I'll fire this, and you engage. Otherwise, hold back." The two snuck ahead, while the others followed much further behind. Eventually they got forwards enough to see a goblin corpse go flying past them, flung by a particularly large and angry owlbear. Gendry took to a nearby tree to see more, and saw a goblin on a wolf bossing around the others, occasionally riding in and slashing at the beast, but mostly staying behind his dozen or so remaining troops. Peregrine snuck around, getting into position to lunge out at the leader. Unfortunately, the warg smelled him and turned, growling. Gendry drew her bow and fired the whistle arrow into the leader's back. The sound of a high whistle and even higher and most unmanly screech echoed into the morning. Peregrine leapt forward, driving back the warg with a pair of swift slashes, laying open its hide. The goblin looked at him with astonishment, then turned to see Gendry, and his jaw dropped. "Elfthing? Elfthing! Scrabble! Get Elfthing! Get Elfthing!" Several of the goblins turned, which was a bad idea for a goblin within owlbear range, and one paid for this by having his head swept from his shoulders by a mighty paw. Highly inaccurate ranged fire rained down on Gendry's location, arrows glancing off branches and leather armor. Hearing this signal, the others charged forwards, coming into visual range. Cazador picked up the javelin of the goblin who went flying earlier and hurled through it, punching through an unfortunate goblin's petty excuse for armor and nailing him to a tree. Julian and Sinkhead dashed forward, Sinkhead leading with her shield to send another goblin flying out of her way. The warg turned and snapped at Peregrine, tearing a chunk of flesh from the halfling's shoulder, licking its lips as it savored the taste. "I assure you, raw is the worst way to have any kind of meat," the cook joked calmly as his sword became wreathed in flames. "Personally, I prefer warg blackened." The warg slunk back with a whimper as the blazing blade pierced through its black hide, producing a most horrid stench, especially after Peregrine ripped it free, sending scorched flesh and black blood erupting onto the floor, which seemed to almost drink it in. Gendry dropped from her perch to behind the tree, leaning out from behind her cover to nail another goblin in the throat, dropping him with a garbled curse. The goblin commander turned to the halfling and swiped downward, only for the darting blades of Avery's chosen to slap it aside. He struck again, and the nimble halfling danced to the side as he overextended and slipped from his mount. The goblin group rushed forwards to try and overwhelm the strange pair that so suddenly rushed them. And scimitars slashed, glancing off shield and armor, but a few lucky blows carved narrow, stinging rivulets and weak points. Meanwhile, the other archers continued pouring more fire into the general area where Gendry was. The owlbear, still singing from its earlier abuse, hurtled into the goblin archer line. It crushed one under its paw before its iron beak lunged forward, caught a goblin by the head, and crushed her skull like a nut. Cazador charged to keep up, swiping once with his axe at the downed goblin. Sinkhead threw aside, spearing his internal organs across a nearby tree, before hitting the mob and burying his other axe in the back of one of their necks. "Three!" Sinkhead bashed one goblin to the ground with her shield, and then swiped downward with her star, bashing the jaw out of another's face. Julian, meanwhile, cleft downwards, the superior weight, steel, and strength of his greatsword shattering through a goblin's scimitar, before rending its wielder from shoulder to groin. He followed through, and caught the next goblin over in the side, splitting open his belly and throwing him to the ground. The warg, sensing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned its rider and fled into the woods, catching a short sword to the hamstring as it ran. Peregrine turned from the cowardly mongrel and leveled his blade at the fallen leader. "Surrender!" he commanded, eyes glowing with mystic authority. The wretched creature's hand shook for a moment before he shook off the spell and launched himself at the halfling with a sudden fury. "I will never bow knee up to slave scum!" he roared as he carved a slash out of Peregrine's cheek. Gendry noted the sudden drop in arrow fire due to Owlbear and decided to assist it by putting a silver arrowhead inside the last archer's brain. Two! With the nearest batch of goblins of fine pace, the still very angry Owlbear hurled into the tattered remnants of the mob attacking the Paladins, bowling through one, then lashing out at Sinket, who caught the beak on her shield. Cazador hewed the creature with one axe and the sole surviving goblin with the other. "4, and the freezer's worth triple to whoever slays ye." "Not the time," Sinket growled as she dug in her cloven feet and shoved back into the owlbear, knocking it back and down before applying her mace to its face. Julian lunged forwards, shifting his grip on the greatsword as he swung it like a batter in a home run contest, rending the owlbear's ribs asunder with a horrid cracking sound. Peregrine and the goblin boss continued their duel, and he landed a blow directly above the heart, but it was deflected by the goblin's ill-fitting mail shirt. Then he palmed his sword and cut the boss on his knee. The goblin responded with 2 deadly but inaccurate slashes that struck the air centimeters from the halfling's limbs. Gendry turned from the badly wounded owlbear to the whirl of blades between the 2 miniature duelists. She drew back her bow, sighed, and let go. The silver arrow had plunged through the boss's armor, split his spine, and emerged through his sternum. The arrogant commander looked down in disbelief, then fell dead. 3. "Nay, lass, that's worth double. 4, Cazador conceded, as he struggled to overcome the owlbear's tough hide, landing no telling blow. Though the creature labored for breath. In a last desperate struggle, it rained beak and claw upon the dragonborn, leaving bloody rents in his scales, crimson blood running on scarlet hide and dwarven mail as he took a single step back and shook his head at the monster's tenacity. All for naught, though, as Sinket lunged low and pushed upwards, muscles straining as she smashed the owlbear under the chin with enough force that it stood up on its back legs. The horned knight took the opening and smashed her Morningstar through the softer underbelly and ravaged ribs into the heart, turning into a sort of red paste, not unlike strawberry jam, finally dropping the huge beast. "All right, next time we find one of those, we go around them." "Agreed," Cazador grudgingly admitted as he patched his wounds with a combination of divine magic to close the rents and a drink from his flask to dull the pain. He wiped his mouth and offered Peregrine a swig as the halfling mended the cut in his face and the gash in his arm. "Thanks, but I don't fancy being carried. That stuff is strong enough for someone your size, let alone a lightweight like me. Anyone else hurt?" "Going to be sore later after throwing that beast, but I'll be fine," Sinket said, as she rolled her shield shoulder and stretched her arm. "Just my pride. Goblins are terrible shots," as she placed her bow back on her back. "For all, a draw this time, Beardless," she said with a grin. "I've got a beard that's made of bone and scale, nae hair, mair than any elven pretty laddie can say." The dragonborn dwarf said crossly as he cleaned off his axes in the stream and sheathed them. The party regrouped, recovering arrows and checking for loot. Cazador compulsively acquired any and all gold and silver coins, while the rest of the party claimed some gems from a bag at the leader's side. Peregrine committed the bodies into the river and said a brief prayer before they moved on, following the blood trail of the ward. Following that trail led them on a somewhat winding path before it crossed back into the river at a shallow ford. From here the blood trail ceased. After some debate, they decided to continue following the river until dark. As the sun dimmed, Sinket started a fire, Peregrine set his lines and net, Julian dragged dead trees to form an improvised barricade around the camp, and Cazador set to work on repairing and maintaining the party's equipment, buffing burrs and mending tears and dents with industrious hands. Indri maintained her own bow, and once that was done, she looked up to the heavens and pulled out a sheet of parchment and a quill. Peregrine looked over curiously as Indri began to chart their position and their path through the day, marking the river and the watchtower. slowly but steadily creating a map, marking the point where they had fought the bugbear and the goblins, but creating a small note of where the war had led them. "You're a cartographer?" he asked curiously, as he noticed one of his lines has a bite and hurried to reel it in. "Yes, since we are in an uncharted land, I thought it might be wise to record where we have been," she replied, pulling a series of small triangles and rulers from her bag to measure against the stars. "How do you keep distances?" Julian asked as he continued his fortifications. "Should using the stars, I'd imagine. The tools aren't that different from the ones the navigators used when I came to this continent," said Cat hypothesized, as she tended the flickering flames. "That, and I've been counting our steps," she said, as she continued to work. "Multiply that by the length of our stride, and we should have a fairly accurate measure. We've traveled 20 miles today. A good start." Gendry looked upwards, slightly below the moon, to see if the moonbow was shining. Not tonight, it seemed. She sighed and put away her tools and map. Peregrine had managed to draw in 2 large trout to add to the night's dinner, and soon they were roasting on a pair of spits. Spirits were high as the Paladins dug in, set watches, and drifted off to sleep. The night passed by quietly until Sinket's watch. As she kept a careful eye on the dark forest around them, it passed by the witching hour, when the moon has set, and the stars are all that watch the woods. In the distance, at the very edge of her vision, she saw once more black vines pulsing like dark veins. Unseen ebony ichor flowed at the uttermost edge of her diabolical sight, where the dark was deepest. She moved closer, looking over the edge of the barricade, but the veins were only ever at the tip of her sight, but they were always there, in every direction she looked. Sigurd, somewhat perturbed by this, aroused Julian and Gendry, somewhat surprised to find that Gendry was sleeping and not in trance. She filed it away for later, as she asked them if they saw what she saw. Gendry looked out to the deep of the woods, and indeed saw them at the very border of her sight. Julian, on the other hand, saw only dark woods, and went back to sleep, muttering about the halflings cooking again. The two agreed that this was definitely not just a side effect of spicy trout, and Gendry took to the trees to get closer, but just as with Suncat, as the vines seemed to retreat, staying only ever where she could just barely make out where the dark met the edge of vision. As an experiment, she cast light on an arrow and fired it into the dark. Peering out, she saw that the vines again existed only at the outermost borders of the light, vanishing and reappearing seemingly in an instant. Somewhat disturbed by this eerie phenomenon, the two began to hold the rest of the watch together. As they stood there in the dark, they began to speak in quiet tones. "So, do elves in this part of the world actually sleep?" Senket asked curiously. "Generally not, but I do," she responded. "Hmm. Are you a diviner?" "What? No. What gave you that idea?" "Looking at the stars, wearing the moonbow on your back, and trying to dream." "How did you know I was trying to dream?" "Lucky guess. The oracles would do something similar. Drink a special brew, smoke a certain plant, and look for the divine and say in strange dreams. Occasionally they'd find something." "That's not a tradition I've heard from." Where are you from, anyways?" "It's a continent called Chult, several weeks' sail south and west from the southernmost ports." "Quite a long ways, then. What made you decide to leave?" "Eve, that's somewhat personal." "I'll tell you if you tell me why you're trying to dream. Bargaining run in the family. Only about as much as randomly swapping sexes runs in yours. Point taken. Sorry. I'm used to it. So, are you going to tell me?" Henry considered it for a few minutes, then sighed. "Seems I'll have to tell someone at some point. May as well be someone who's willing to fight alongside me. Do you know what happens in trance? It's basically a better version of sleep, right? You get more aware and get rested in half the time, right?" "Not exactly. Well, not just that. In trance, an elf relives memories of both our current lives, and for the youngest and oldest among us, memories of our past lives." I'd heard that Corellans spat elf souls back out into new bodies. Never realized they remembered the old bodies they had. A bit cruder than I'd have put it, but that's more or less how it's supposed to work, yes? You say supposed to work. I take it that there are times when it doesn't? Yes. And you're one of those times, so you dream hoping to remember an old life. Yes. Does it ever work? Gendry grimaced, rubbing the back of her head through her pale hair. Occasionally. Either that or they're just normal nightmares. Nothing good, but at least there's something. Alright, your side of the bargain now. Long story short, religion and family issues. Do you remember the soul plague that happened about 10 years ago? Right, I was just finishing my training in the wilderness, and it wasn't it some lich trying to become a god? Asarak, that's the one. I was 12 when they destroyed him. That was all anyone talked about. Of course, not everyone looked at the soulmonger's death the same way. Some people thought it posed a remarkable opportunity to gobble up the rather huge number of souls that were released. I take it this is where the family issues come in. Right. To make a very long story short, the same people who destroyed Asarak wound up dealing with this particular cult, including a certain paladin by the name of Sir Arvidor. It was him who wound up taking me in after that whole mess. He trained me, and eventually left me in charge of the small shrine to Pelor we'd built there. I take it something happened to the shrine. Ubtao happened. Who's Ubtao? He's the god of primordial, actually. After the whole soulmonger said, he offered the people who destroyed that monster rather remarkable amounts of power. They all accepted, except Arvidor. Ubtao held a grudge, so one day an earthquake struck, wipes out the shrine, and then about 20-odd dinosaurs show up to make sure that the shrine stays out. I was smart enough to not stay on a continent with an angry god, and was on the first boat out of there, admittedly without a ticket. Wound up working my way out of there, and just kept traveling northeast, hoping I could find Arvidor. Any trace? None. Every lead I had seems to suggest he's on another plane. Whether he's traveling or dead, can't be sure. Still, I'll figure out it eventually. For now, the gods have me here, and that's where I'll keep fighting. They passed the rest of the night in silence, Sinkat eventually heading back down at Sandry's insistence. The paladins awoke, slightly groggy, Sinkat perpetually so. To deal with the grogginess, she began to boil water, then added a packet of something that looked like dirt and smelled rich and bitter. What in the nine hells is that? Julian asked. Coffee. It's a bean that grows where I'm from, and a few places on this continent. When you grind it up and boil it, it gives people the equivalent of a few extra hours of sleep. You're welcome to some. Julian and Cazador declined, but Gendry and Peregrine took her up on the offer. Both were slightly horrified at the taste, but Sin casually sipped hers while they discussed the strange visions of last night and determined their next course of action. The Paladins decided to continue following the river, and Peregrine suggested that they create a raft to speed their travels. After a few hours of work, they were successful and rowed along their merry way, Peregrine acting as captain, while Sinket, Julian, and Cazador handled pulling. Around midday, they were busy eating their lunch when Gendry and Peregrine's ears perked up at the sudden sound of rushing waters. Looking ahead, the party saw the land begin to fall away, and the river running in a series of rapids and cataracts down with it. Cazador leapt to his feet to try to get to the pole, unbalancing the raft and falling out for his troubles. Julian tossed him a line, while Sinket seized the pole and attempted to push them ashore. Peregrine secured the food in his pack, and Yenri tied a second line to an arrow, firing it into a nearby tree. Cazador foundered slightly, cursing loudly in Dwarfish as the rapid current began to pull him and the raft into the cataracts. Julian tried for all he was worth to pull the angry dragonborn in, and Sinket pushed hard against the current. Peregrine grabbed the tree line, trying to hold them fast, but instead became pulled from the raft. Gendry dove to catch him, and slid off as well, holding onto his ankles as he held onto the rope. Despite their best efforts, the raft went over, as did Cazador. Julian, in desperation, flared his wings and took flight, unable to haul the dragonborn out of the water, but at least to keep him above it. And as Sinket realized the futility of trying to break free, she swiped outwards with the pole and managed to push Gendry aside into the shallows where the tall elf could stand upright. Gendry and Peregrine managed to use their rope to pull themselves ashore, and Julian kept dry in the air. Cazador took a few bashes to his legs and one to his manhood, prompting a wheezing cough. Sinket, on the other hand, held on for dear life to the raft as it rolled and pitched before her grip slipped and she went flying. By sheer luck, she landed on the bough of a nearby tree, her tunic caught in the branches. Peregrine offered a small prayer to Yondola in thanks as the raft leapt from atop up the nearby rocks and crashed off the stream, breaking upon a rocky bar. Cazador limped out of the stream. "Take off," he said. "It'll be easy and peaceful," he said. "Bloody halflings!" he cursed as he sat down and judiciously applied some healing magic and equally judiciously applied alcohol to his throat. One minor throttling of Peregrine later, Later, the party got Sinket down from her tree and spent the next few hours retrieving their supplies and drying off, making frequent use of thaumaturgy. They continued on for the next few hours until the dark set in and they set up camp. Fortunately, Ginfrey's map and cartography supplies were in their case, and so the map continued. Another night haunted by shadow vines passed without incident, though the party could still hear the howling of wolves in the distance. None could tell if this was more goblin riders or just wolves being wolves. In any case, they doused the fire and slept with one eye open. In the morning they marched onwards until they saw the woods beginning to thin and spied a bridge in the distance, with two towers on either side. Yenri approached stealthily and observed that this old bridge, most likely of dwarven and human make, has been occupied by yet further hobgoblins, though these ones have not yet set up their fortified encampment. The party considered how to deal with the problem. They fully intended to take the bridge, but they could not assault one side without the other being able to send for reinforcements. As a result, they decided to attack from three sides. Yenri and Zinket would attack from one side of the river, while Cazador and Peregrine attacked from the other. In the meanwhile, Julian would swim through the river, fly onto the bridge from the center, and strike into the back lines of whatever side seemed weaker. Julian loaned Cazador his crossbow, then Peregrine and Cazador swam across the river and moved to the tree line on one side, watching the bridge and road. There were two crossbowmen, one in each tower, and a guard at the foot of each tower. Two guards in the center of the bridge sat down and started playing cards. On the opposite end, Sinket and Yendri saw a similar scene, although the guards on the bridge proper were busy discussing something in their rough tongue. Julian hung back at tree line, waiting for things to start before he started swimming. The rest of the party took aim. A stone flew, a bolt loosed, an elven bow sang, and a bolt of hellfire streamed through the late morning light. Cazador's shot went wide. Peregrine's stone cracked across a crossbow hod's hand, leaving broken bones and a stinging welt. The recipient of the silver arrow fell quietly, one, while the unfortunate woman set ablaze did not go quietly, but rather began screaming as her hair was engulfed in purple flames. Julian took that for his signal, and plunged into the chill waters towards the bridge. The confused hobgoblins turned towards their screaming comrade, but the slung hob barked a warning that they were on the other side as well. Peregrine confirmed this by hitting him in the mouth with another bullet. Indri finished the blazing hobgoblin, muttering "two" under her breath. Cazador took a more careful aim and picked off the unwounded hobgoblin with a lucky shot to the eye. "One!" Julian continued closer, swimming forwards to the bridge until its shadow passed over him. Then he surfaced. Singh had left the cover of the tree line, charging forwards into the very surprised hobgoblins and smashing one of the tower guards over the side of the head. The surviving crossbow hobgoblin ducked into his tower, away from the stinging missiles. Meanwhile, the rest of that side leapt to their feet and began advancing in a phalanx towards Cazador and Peregrine. Across the bridge, the bludgeoned hobgoblin took a swipe at Singhet, which she caught on her shield. The others began moving in, but only one got close enough to take another strike with his halberd, which her mail turned aside. Peregrine spotted the hobgoblin who hadn't had time to properly link up with the phalanx and charged him, two swords opening long cuts in his legs. Yendri finished the wounded hobgoblin, expertly placing an arrow through the melee under Sinket's arm directly into his abdomen. 3. Julian erupted from the river, wings raised in their angelic glory as he dove toward the hobgoblins attacking Sinket. The rearmost one turned in utter shock, just barely able to get his shield up in time to deflect the greatsword, falling like a guillotine towards him. Sen sidestepped, put in the wall to her left side to keep from being flanked as she laid into another hobgoblin, his crude scale mail keeping his ribs intact. Cazador smiled at the phalanx and punished the formation with a gout of flame from his jaws, scorching their shields and forcing them to scatter. Wearing out, the phalanx shattered, one breaking off to aid his comrade, who very successfully murdered the ground next to Peregrine. Then the other two circled Cazador, cautiously striking, one from each side, and each repulsed by dwarven armor and skillfully wielded axes. Across the bridge, the blue-nosed hobgoblin realized that he had been pincered, and in desperation launched an all-out assault on Julian, forsaking his shield to use both hands on his longsword. He was rewarded with a sudden red stain blossoming upon the Azamar's tunic. Meanwhile, his minions proved unable to break through Singet's iron defenses. Peregrine rolled under his hobgoblin's legs, cutting them out from under him, and then executed the downed Winter with a stab through the back of his neck. Indri kept the pressure on, catching another one in the shoulder. Sinkat followed through, broke his guard, and then his neck. Meanwhile, Kazdor laid into the weaker hobgoblin, the one who took more of a burning from his breath. The first axe split his shield, the second, the skull. Two! Julian struck the hobbleater right in his blue nose with his pommel, stunning him just long enough to slip around his guard and lay open his side with a lunging stab. The hobgoblin leader looked across the bridge and saw that there was no escape to be found there, so he took his chances, disengaging and fleeing, clutching his wounded side. Across the way, the crossbowman poked his head up and saw that all his friends were dead. He ran the numbers, took aim with his crossbow, and fired. His former commander lay dead with a crossbow bullet in his back an instant later. The last hobgoblin launched a desperate attack on Kazdor's turn back, laying it open and breathing easier for just a moment before Kazdor turned around, growling. Meanwhile, his friend managed to land a shallow cut across Peregrine's forehead. Peregrine swiped, blood flowing into his eye and ruining the strike. The hobgoblin smacked it down and trapped the blade under his foot. However, he failed to realize that the orientation of the sword was up as he went to trap it, and accidentally cut his own foot in half. Peregrine was so embarrassed for him that he struck him with the flat of his other blade, knocking him out. Andrew was surprised to see the blue nose go down, and her eyes tracked the shot's likely path back to the traitor. She knew she should feel disgust, but couldn't help but feel a certain strange respect for a well-executed backstab. Cazador made these loyal surviving Hobbs regret striking him in the back, or ever being born, for that matter. Blood was not the only of that poor bastard's fluids pouring out around his newly headless body. Julian flew up to the treacherous marksman, who threw down his weapon and placed his hands behind his head. "Boys, surrender," he said in rough common. After retrieving their arrows and once again looting the bodies, Yendri and Cazador returned to the tower where Julian was busy interrogating the traitor. Apparently, these hobgoblins serve the same master as the one once back at the watchtower. The traitor, named Swart, was press-ganged into serving them after their captain, a ferocious warlord and servant of Magulliabet named Pompey, had conquered his village. Pompey and his horde had come down out of the north years ago and briefly settled in the ruined city of San Jonas, driving out the former kobold inhabitants. However, they were in turn driven out by a roving orc warband who had driven them out of the city with heavy losses, forcing them to retreat to the south. There they found an ancient abbey with walls of blood-red stone. Pompey apparently declared the place a holy site and had been using it as his base ever since, gathering his strength and locking down any paths and transport accesses in the area, preparing to march San Jonas once more. Sen started slightly at the mention of the abbey and asked if there had been a tiefling there when they had taken it. Swart said there wasn't. Senkat asked about the dark vines at night, and Swart looked at her like she was crazy. Meanwhile, Peregrine revived his captain, named Jort, and he corroborated Swart's story with additional comments not to trust Swart. After acquiring the location of the abbey, 2 days' march south on the road, and the location of San Jonas, a week to the north, the party debated what to do with their captives. Julian wanted to bring them along. Peregrine wanted to bring along Jort, but not Swart. Cinco agreed, and with Peregrine. Cazador wanted to kill them both, and Yendri abstained. And after a few minutes of tense debate, plurality ruled. Jort agreed to come along, while Swart couldn't be happier to get out of there. A rather tense argument about whether or not to give Jort his weapons ensued, and a compromise was reached where he was allowed to keep his armor and a quarterstaff. Cazador held on to his shield, sword, and crossbow. With a new goal in mind, the party turned their eyes southwards and marched onwards towards the Bloodstone Abbey and onwards towards destiny.